Well, I'm trying to share my screen. Here we go. All right, can everybody see the presentation? I'm gonna take that as a yes. Okay, so thank you everybody for being here today. I'm very excited to share this research with you all. And I just want to start by saying that, as Brian was saying before, when I took on this research that I'm presenting today, the decision may have surprised a few people who knew me because I have worked mostly with birds before. But over time, I've really come to appreciate fishes as a group of organisms. They're great to work with, and I am especially impressed by just the diversity of freshwater fish in the U.S. As you can see in this map that I pulled from a publication. So this map indicates the diversity of freshwater fish in the U.S. Overall, they say there are over 800 species in the U.S., which is a lot. And the colors indicate just how many species are in different parts of the U.S. And as you can see in the Southeast, it's really a hotspot for freshwater fish diversity, and that's really impressive. But today we're going to focus on a specific group of fishes in this presentation. They are from the family Catostomidae. So you have your suckers and red horses. They are a non-game species, so they're different from the bass or trout or salmon that you hear a lot about. There are at least 76 species in the US, and 44 of them are in the Southeast, which is another indication of how diverse the Southeast is in terms of fish diversity. And they do occupy a range of life history strategies. Some of them are short-lived, some of them are really long-lived. They can live up to 30, 40 years. And also they occupy different habitats as well. Some of them live in lakes and others live in streams and large rivers. And many of them do perform seasonal migrations to and from their spawning sites. Many people may have heard of the long salmon migration that salmons perform every year, but these fish do perform those seasonal migrations as well. It's just not as well known. And here's, I'm just showing kind of the different species of suckers and red horses that you may find in the Southeast. As you can see, they can look fairly similar to each other. And if some people were wondering why some of them are called red horses, and it's because, as you can see here, their face are elongated in some, especially obviously in some species, and it kind of makes them looks like a horse. And some of them they also have red fins. Especially during the spawning season. So hence red horse. And there are some conservation issues that these species are facing recently. So they are migratory, as I mentioned, and there are migration barriers within their habitats, one of which would be the hydropower dams. So if there are dams and they can't get to the other side of the dams, they can't access some of their habitats. Habitat degradation is also an issue from urbanization, agriculture. There could be runoff or contamination in the rivers. And also there has been evidence of predation by exotic or introduced species on these fishes. And really just general lack of knowledge about this group of fish that's kind of impeding how effectively we can conserve this group of fish species. But why do we care about these fish? Well, they do perform some important ecological roles because they are migratory. They act as nutrient transport and cycling in the rivers. Their eggs can serve as food source for a lot of other species. And because they feed on invertebrate and bivalves, so they can have effect on those communities as well. And because they prefer clean rivers, as many fishes do, they can serve as indicator species for river health. And some species also have cultural significance in this group because some of them are historically consumed by some indigenous tribes in the US. So really the overarching theme of my dissertation research is how do we effectively conserve imperil catostomid fishes in the southeastern US? And we hope to achieve this or contribute to this by doing these 3 smaller projects. And the first one is to help estimating population parameters and population dynamics of Sicklefin Redhorse that Brian mentioned in Georgia. The second part is to apply a decision-making process to help stakeholders make conservation decisions for robust redhorse, which is the other star of the show. And then lastly, we just want to know really how learning works, or sorry, how a group of stakeholders learn with each other and how they apply that learning to conservation of its imperiled species. All right, so starting with the first part, really brief background on the Sicklefin Redhorse. It's actually not officially described as a species so far, hopefully will be soon, but they occupy 2 main river basins in the Southeast. One is the Little Tennessee River Basin, which you see in the upper right corner in the map, and the other one is the Hiawassee River Basin. And the red circled part is the Brasstown Creek population in Georgia that you can see on the map here. And this is one of the species where they have in the past served as important food source for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And actually, so you can see that, sorry, my mouse, their fin is where they got the Sicklefin name, and the Cherokee Indians do also have a name for them that means 1 feather on top, which I think is very apt. So one of the threats that they are facing recently is there's a lot of, because they live in rivers in the Southern Appalachians, which recently have gone through a lot of development, and that could potentially degrade their habitat. So there are a lot of stakeholders who care about this fish, and they formed what is called the Sicklefin Redhorse Conservation Committee. They go through a lot of conservation They do a lot of monitoring and also implement some of the conservation actions. And also there is a candidate conservation agreement among some stakeholders, including federal agencies, state agencies, and utilities to help conserve the species. So really our main question here is what can we do to help contribute to gain a better understanding, help people gain a better understanding of the status of Sicklefin Redhorse population. And we narrowed the range down to just looking at the Brasstown Creek population in Georgia, because that's the population where they have done a lot of population monitoring. And because they have been using different types of gear to monitor this population, we also want to see just how effective are these different sampling techniques. All right, so on this screen, you will see the 2 main types of gears that the biologists have been using to monitor Sicklefin Redhorse in this area. So on the left-hand side, you see the 5 net, which is basically a big net with 2 wings that runs across the river, and they are set up right below the spawning site of the Sicklefin Redhorse. So when they migrate upstream to their spawning site, they will get guided into this net and then guided into the holding area. And on the right-hand side is the pit antenna. So when fish are captured physically, they are weighed, measured, and all that. And then they're also inserted with a pit tag. And after that, whenever they pass by a pit antenna, the antenna will pick up the signal from their tag, and they can be ID'd that way as well. So the 5 nets on the they can be kind of labor intensive when they're being used in terms of setup and takedown. They are usually only used for a few days at a time during or near migration season, whereas the pit antenna can be set up and left out there for a few months at a time with minimal, still some maintenance during the sampling period. And again, they can be left out for months at a time, so they can pick up a lot of recaptures, which is useful for modeling the population. But perhaps the biggest advantage that the pike nets have over pit antenna is that they allow for actually physically capturing and marking of the fish, whereas antenna can only redetect those fish that have already been marked. And just want to quickly show how the pike net works. All right, that was fun. Excuse me. So with all that data, what we're hoping to achieve is to use the model to estimate some important population dynamic parameters to gain a better understanding of how many fish there are in the population, how well they are at surviving from one year to another, how many new individuals enter the population each year. And again, as I was said before, what is the detection probability and how do they differ from the gear type, between gear type. And we do this by constructing what is called a capture history from the capture data that we were provided with by from the Sicklefin Redhorse Conservation Committee. So imagine that you're following this adult Sicklefin Redhorse from year to year between 2016 and 2021. So during 2016, we know that it's alive because we caught it in the pike net. And in 2017, it wasn't captured in the pike net, but we did see it on the antenna data. And in 2018, it was still alive, but it was not observed. And the reason why we know it was alive is because we saw it again the next year by both pike and antenna. But then maybe after that, it died, and then we just never saw it again in the wild. So this is how we're hoping to estimate those parameters using this capture data, capture history. All right, moving on to results. So the survival probability, sorry, back up. I'm going to show a series of figures that look very similar. On the x-axis, you will see the year that is the sampling period from 2016 to 2021. And on the y-axis are the various parameters of interest that we were able to obtain from the models. So first one is the survival probability. So I should also say that we use the same model framework to analyze only pike data and also analyze antenna and pike data, so we can see how much information antenna data adds to the modeling process and the results. So on the figures, you will see two sets of points. The orange one, or salmon one, is the results from when we analyze the combined data set with antenna and pike data. And the green/blue points are the results from where we only analyze the pike data. And the vertical bars you see are the 95% Bayesian confidence intervals. So as you can see, there are actually a little bit of a difference between the two sets of results that you see here in terms of trend. So when we analyze only the pike only data, it appears that survival rate or survival probability increased over time, but the trend is different from the combined data set results. And also the Bayesian confidence intervals, credible intervals, are a little narrower for when we analyze the combined data sets. So when we get to the population size, that's where things get really interesting because when we analyze the combined data set, what you can see on the left-hand side, the population size ranged between somewhere between 100 and maybe a little over 200 individuals. So that's not very big. And on the right-hand side, when we analyze only the FIC data, the population size was estimated to be somewhere between 500 and 1,500 individuals. But again, as you can see, the credible intervals are much wider for the FIC-only results. And notably, the population size both appear to be decreasing over time. So in terms of recruitment, we estimated number of adults recruited into the population, the spawning population every year, and the results are actually fairly comparable between the results from two data sets. And but again, as you can see, the estimates are a lot more uncertain when we only analyze the FIC data. And also interestingly, the FIC detection probability that we estimated from the two data sets, the detection probability from FIC-only data set are a lot lower compared to the combined data set. And we think it might be because the population size estimated by the combined data set is a lot smaller. So even though we're detecting the same number of fish in both by FICnet in both data sets, where proportionally we seem to be detecting more fish when the population is a lot smaller. And the last figure is about the antenna detection probabilities, and they seem to be fairly consistent over time, hovering around 0.5, so 50%, which is not bad, and it's actually kind of similar to other studies where they, excuse me, where they estimate antenna detection probability as well as around 0.4 or 0.5. So just to putting all that together, it seems that by combining both the antenna and FIC data in our data set to make inference about the population, that combined data set does produce more precise estimates of population parameters. So using that antenna to collect more detections over time, that seems to help with our estimation process. And this all definitely helped us understand the differences between capture probability between the years. Antenna detected more fish, but that kind of makes sense because they were set out there for a long time. And the results, especially for population size, could have some important management implications for the managers if they make conservation decisions based on if the conservation decisions are state dependent. So let's say if they want to stock a river or take individuals out of the river to stock somewhere else, their decision might be different when there are thought to be 200 fish versus 1,000 fish. So, all right, moving on. So moving on to the other star of the show, as I said before, the robust redhorse. Again, a really quick background on the species. This species is described, it was actually described in the 1870s, but it actually wasn't seen again in the wild until the 1980s. So it was during that time, it was considered quote unquote lost to science, and it was very exciting when it was seen again, and I did. Their current range includes the Piedmont and upper coastal plains of Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, as you can see on the right here in the map. They are migratory again, and they spawn between April and May, sometimes even in June as well. And their spawning grounds, they prefer spawning grounds that consist a lot of clean gravel, because clean gravel tend to have these interspatial spaces between the gravel where they can lay their eggs, where the eggs can hatch and the larvae can emerge. And also with robust redhorse, there is a robust redhorse conservation committee similar to the Sicklefin committee, except this one is actually a lot, it was established in 1995, which was a lot older than the Sicklefin committee. And it was established under a memorandum of understanding between a lot of different partners from federal agencies, state agencies, the utilities, and some nonprofits as well. So this group of stakeholders come together. They want to understand, because the species was lost to science for so long. They want to get a better understanding of the species' natural history, but also conduct some monitoring activities to see what is the status of the species. Currently, there are some factors that are thought to affect the population of robust redhorse. One of them is water level or water flow in the rivers. So robust redhorse, especially during the spawning season, water flow is important, because if there are not enough water, in the river, their eggs may dry out. But if there's too much water flow, then the eggs and larvae may not also survive, because too much flow would affect their swimming abilities and such. And migratory barriers is also an important factor that may affect the populations. There are currently several hydropower dams within their habitat, within their range. So if they can't, there's nothing that help them get over those barriers, such as a fishway, a passageway, then they can't access some of the spawning grounds that they like. And also, the increase of water temperature could also affect juvenile or larvae robust redhorse as well, because increase in river water temperature can potentially cause some deformities in the larvae, which may cause death. So that could affect the survival probability of earlier life stages of robust redhorse. And lastly, so one of the things that could affect actually the adult robust redhorse in the system is bow fishing by bow fishermen. So earlier I showed this picture of a lot of species of robust, or a lot of species of catostomid fishes, but I failed to mention that actually I snuck in a picture of a common carp in here, which, as you can see, looks a lot like some of the sucker species, especially robust redhorse. And there has been incidents of fishermen taking a robust redhorse thinking that they are common carp, and there can be some incidental takes in that regard. So that could negatively affect adult robust redhorse populations. So given all these, now what we know about the status of the population and factors that may affect their populations, our job in this part of the research is basically help the stakeholders of RRCC to make conservation decisions using a value-based approach, and also a transparent process to make effective conservation decisions. And that process is called structured decision-making. And it involves several steps. So first, we define the problem that we're trying to solve, and then we elicit the management objectives that the group is trying to achieve in order to solve their problem. And then we also elicit some management alternatives, which are sometimes some actions that the group would like to implement in order to achieve their objectives. And using a modeling tool, we evaluate those alternatives to see what are the consequences that they may result in. How would the population or the species respond to those alternatives if they were implemented? And after that, hopefully, we can identify a preferred alternative to implement. But I also want to mention the adaptive management process, which is actually a special case of SDM, where after you implement an action, you monitor how the population or species respond to set action, and then you update your beliefs or your models to based on what you've learned about through monitoring. So adaptive management is really useful when you're trying to make iterative decisions, either every year or every 3 years or what have you. And through this process, it can really help you maybe reduce some of the uncertainty that you have about the species and help you make better decisions in the future. So the top part, the SDM part of the adaptive management process is sometimes called the startup phase. And the bottom part is sometimes called the iterative phase, because that's why you can do iteratively over time. And again, our overall goal is to guide our CC stakeholders through an SDM process as a setup for them to implement adaptive management down the road. So we did this by facilitating a series of workshops with our CC stakeholders between 2017 and 2020. And through those workshops, the group identified 4 major management units that they want to focus on in terms of management. So they are pointed out in the red circles on the map, where they are Altamaha and Broad, Savannah, and PD. So, and then after that, we also solicited some management objectives, as I mentioned before, as part of the process, which the objectives are shared across the units. However, because of the land use histories and just how different the habitats and populations are among these management units, the scenarios or management actions that we solicited are actually different among these units. All right, so what did we elicit from the group in terms of objectives? Excuse me. So we separated the objectives into a fundamental objective, which is basically what the group really wants. What does it ultimately want? What ultimately matters to them, which is robust redhorse population persistence. We want the population and the species to persist in the future. And the means objectives are basically what must be achieved in order to achieve this fundamental objective. And I'm just highlighting 2 of them here. There were many. One of them is stable population demography, and the other one is self-sustaining population. And so how do we measure, how do we know if a certain management scenario or action achieves the objectives? So we use something called performance metric that we can calculate and measure using the modeling toolkit. So for the first objective, the stable population demography objective, the group wanted to see what is the probability of persistence of a population over the simulation period. And for the self-sustaining population objective, the group wanted to see, okay, what is the adult abundance over last 25 years of the simulation? And to calculate the probability of persistence, we're basically asking, are there any fish left at all in the population at the end? And for the adult abundance metric, we're basically averaging adult abundance across the last 25 years for each iteration. And I will explain what iteration means. So how do we measure all these things? So we want to essentially forecast the populations into the future under each management units to see how they will fare under different management scenarios. And we do that using what is called a population viability analysis. But before we can do that, we need to parameterize this population viability analysis model, so it will know what kind of parameter values that to use to project the populations. And one of the ways that we did that is to actually use existing captured data of robust redhorse, and we use the data sets from Savannah and PD, because those are the most complete data sets. And we run that through a population estimation model, which is actually not too different from the one that I presented for Sicklefin Redhorse. And from that, we we obtain some model estimated parameter values, but we actually don't have data for all of the parameters that we need to use. So for the parameters that we don't have any information for, we elicited those from the experts during the STM workshops that I was talking about. And putting all that together into the PVA, we then get something that looks like this figure on the right, where on the x-axis you have time maybe from 1 to 100 years. That's the time frame that we're using, and on the y-axis is the metric that I was talking about. And we ran the model for 1,000 iterations. And both the estimation and the PVA model are based on a very similar structure that is stage-based. So in this figure, you can see that that there are several stages that we're using in these models, going from egg to H0 fish, to being a juvenile, young adult, and an old adult. So we're basically saying, okay, from 1 year to the next, a fish will move from one stage to the next. And the probability of them going from one stage to the next depends on survival probability of each stage, which is phi that you can see here, and also transition probability, because for some of these stages, a fish may stay in the same stage from 1 year to the next. They may not necessarily transition into the next stage. So we also estimate and use a transition probability as well. All right, one last thing before getting to the results. So as I was mentioned before, the management scenarios do differ for most of the management units that we're looking at. But largely, these are the main management actions or scenarios that the group considered. First one is climate change, which I mentioned could have a negative effect on survival of eggs. Stocking is an action that has been implemented by the group for several of the management units, and they also would like to continue doing that as well. So that would directly contribute to the number of H0s in the population. And water flow adjustment could, adjusting water flow during the spawning and rearing season to the optimal level where it could benefit survival of egg and H0 fish is also another thing that the group is considering. Increasing connectivity, as I mentioned before, between habitat patches that are currently blocked by the barriers, could also potentially increase H0 survival. And lastly, bow fishing regulation could potentially increase survival of the old adults in the populations. All right, and again, I'm going to show a few figures that look very similar. On the x-axis, these are the PVA results. So on the x-axis, you have simulation year from 1 to 100. And on the y-axis, you have the respective performance metrics that we're looking at. So first off, for Altamaha and Broad, the group actually had have the same management scenarios that they envision for these two management units. They are either status quo, stocking for only 5 years, or maybe stocking for 25 years in the beginning, and also bow fishing regulation, which has been observed in bow fishing mortality has been observed in these management units, and also a combination of a few of these, just to see how that would affect the population. And as you can see, especially, it's probably more obvious in Altamaha, the management scenarios where we combine stocking with some sort of water flow adjustment would result in higher adult abundance in the end. And yeah, it's the same for Broad as well. So if you're only stocking or not, or under the status quo scenario, even though you have adults in the end, you're not meeting your management objective, which are the dashed lines that you can see on the figure. So for savanna, the group considered management scenarios that included either increasing connectivity, increasing flow adjustment, and also climate change, or a combination of a few of these. So as you can see, climate change without any other actions implemented would result in pretty much 0 adults in the end, whereas a combination of a lot of the combination of flow and connectivity, which is the top line that you see here, resulted in the most adults in the end. And in the PD, they only considered stocking as a management action, but they did want to know how effective stocking is at helping the population persist. So they want to see what will happen if stocking target is met every single year, and also, but what happens if stocking target is met only every other year versus no stocking at all, and also what would happen if no stocking is met with climate change. And perhaps not too surprising, so the no stocking scenario under the context of climate change would probably lead to the least adults in the population. And even though the stocking target is met every year, it appears that that scenario would not meet the management objective that group has set, which is 500 adults. So, and this is a very similar metric that I was showing before. That's basically, as I was saying, we're averaging the adult abundance for the last 25 years for each iteration in the simulation. So basically what we're seeing here is a very similar values, but we're only looking at the last bit of the simulation. And another metric that we looked at is probability of persistence, as I mentioned before. And this reflects fairly similarly the same pattern as the adult abundance metric. So for Altamaha, the scenarios where stocking is combined with flow resulted in fairly high probability of persistence. But mind you that, again, we're basically looking at if there's any fish left at all in the population, which the group might consider some sort of quasi-extinction or quasi-extirpation value in the future to see if that would work better. And in savanna, again, climate change led to a probability of persistence for the population that does not meet the management objective. So the objective for all of these management units is 0.95 that was set by the group for probability of persistence. And in savanna, climate change is the only scenario that did not meet that. And same with PD as well. And again, putting all this together just to highlight a couple of the conclusions that we had. In some of the cases, stocking combined with habitat enhancement of some sort that would potentially result in higher or earlier life stage survivals could result in higher persistence and adult abundance in the end. And for some populations, at least for the adult abundance, may remain below target regardless of what management scenarios that we implemented. And just to bring everything back towards adaptive management. So that is something that the group would like to implement down the road. And there are some steps that I just want to quickly highlight here. In order to actually implement adaptive management, the group would have to identify some recurrent decisions because it is an iterative process. So if there are any decisions that they want to make, every year or every other year or something. And an example will be stocking. That's a fairly obvious one. And also they need to identify some of the uncertainties to reduce with learning, as I was mentioning before. And one of them could be, survival probability of earlier life stages, which we don't have a lot of data information for. And also monitoring is a very important part of adaptive management. So in order to know how the populations or the species will respond to the implementation of actions, we need a monitoring protocols that can help us understand that. And so traditional adaptive management sort of focuses on this reducing uncertainty part, but we feel that it's also important to understand the learning capacity and the adaptive capacity of the stakeholders or the biologists who are managing the species. And that brings me to the last part of my talk, which is assessing social learning in the context of imperiled fish species conservation. All right, first of all, what is social learning? Well, turns out there's not really like a unified definition for this term, but for my research, I borrowed from two definitions that I thought make sense. The first one is social learning is a process that involves active deliberation and engagement by diverse actors, environmental governance, which can lead to new understanding or shared meaning among stakeholders. And the other one that I thought also makes sense to me is that social learning is learning that occurs when people engage one another, sharing diverse perspectives and experiences to develop a common framework of understanding and basis for joint action. So I think that joint action part is also very important. And why do we want to learn about social learning? So there are literature that have investigated social learning under natural resource management contexts, and they found that incorporating diverse knowledge can help create new innovative solutions to problems. And also the process where stakeholders engage with each other can enhance stakeholder experience and also increase stakeholder buy-in in the eventual solution or management action. So the aim of this part of my research is to basically examine social learning in imperiled species conservation using RCC as a case study. And basically we have three main research questions. The first one is just to get a bit better understand of has social learning occurred as an outcome of collaboration and deliberation among stakeholders of RCC. And also, since this process is so important to effective management, what factors act as facilitators or barriers to the social learning process? And lastly, I mentioned the joint action part of one of the definitions. So we want to know, does social learning lead to collective actions that benefit either the species, Robust Redhorse, or the environment? And collective actions here are just any actions that are taken by the stakeholders as a group to benefit the species. So to answer our research questions, we used two main data sets. The first one is we reviewed the meeting minutes or meeting summaries from the Robust Redhorse Conservation Committee annual meetings. So they meet every year and they provide a summary of what went on during the meetings every year as well. And the other data set that we relied on is semi-structured interviews that we conducted with 20 of our past and current RCC members to ask them about their experience since they joined the RCC. So the interviews lasted between 24 and 75 minutes. And again, we just wanted, during the interview, we wanted to see what they have learned about either the species or the ecosystem, what they have learned about each other, about other RCC members, and also just their overall experience during the collaboration and deliberation process. And in the end, we interviewed 3 participants from federal agencies, 11 from state agencies, 4 from utilities, and 2 from academic institutions. So what do we do with all this data? For those who may not be super familiar with what qualitative data analysis is, it's basically looking at either maybe text or sometimes it can be images to pull out patterns that you see that could potentially answer your questions. So on the left-hand side, you can see here's some text. In our case, it's either the meeting documents or the transcriptions from the interviews. And what I did, or how this usually works, is you look at the data, the text, and see again if there's anything that jumps out at you that could help you answer your research questions, and you assign a quote-unquote code to the data. That is basically a description of what that text means. And in the end, you combine some of these codes together into categories. And so in this example, maybe if I see a respondent saying the word passion, and also another time they mentioned they learned that other RSC's members have a love for nature or for fish, then those can be codes that can be combined into a category that means value of RSC's members. So what do we learn from all this? So it's from both the document review and interviews, it's fairly apparent that learning has definitely occurred on both the group level and the individual level. So both the group as a whole and the RSC's members have gained knowledge, a lot of knowledge about the species and the ecosystem. For example, there was a lot of research going on to understand the natural history of robust redhorse in terms of their habitat reference, their movement, which is really important, and eventually learn how to manage these populations. They also learned a lot about the genetics of the different populations as well, which also has some management implications because they now know which populations should be managed separately and not mix them together in order to preserve some of that genetic diversity. And also a lot of research went into how to run a successful stocking program, which includes aquaculture techniques. So they learned what kind of food is best to feed the fish, the larvae in captivity, and how best to ensure their survival to stock. And lastly, of course, all of the potential threats that I mentioned before that could affect the robust redhorse populations, they all came from the research that was done by this group. And as I mentioned before, there's also evidence of learning on the individual level as well. So during the interviews, I'm just highlighting some quotes that I received from the respondents. One of them said that since joining the RSCC and being involved with all the research and collaboration, it kind of opened their eyes to how the systems that robust redhorse are in, the large river systems, and that they're actually more intricate than they thought even after their years of education. And another respondent said to me that they worked mostly in small streams before they joined the RSCC and started working with robust redhorse. And now, since robust redhorse live in big river systems, which is a different beast on logistical nightmares, but they also just gained a much deeper understanding of how these big river systems differ from the smaller streams in terms of how resilient they are. So another outcome of this learning process, social learning process, is how the stakeholders have learned about each other's values. And again, I will highlight this by pulling out this quote from an interview. So this respondent said that they think the common bond between the RSC's members is that, which is something that they have learned over time, is that they all share a natural resource background. And because of that, they all initially shared a love and respect for natural resource, which took everybody down that professional path. And they think that it has the common bond that they share is one of the reasons that has kept this group together and moving forward all this time. All right. the next outcome that I discovered from doing all this document review and interviews is that there's definitely been some, one of the outcomes is definitely a newly developed working relationships among the RCC members, or just a strengthening of current working relationships that I already had. So why is that important? The better working relationships makes for more efficient coordination in terms of monitoring efforts or research efforts. They can pull resources together and manpower together very quickly. They also feel very comfortable reaching out to each other outside of these annual meetings as well, whether if they have questions about robust red horse or not robust red horse related questions as well. And again, it leads to easier collaboration that is not related to robust RCC. So if they work on other projects together, they don't feel the need to have to develop a new working relationship because they already have one through RCC. So the second research question, as I mentioned before, is we want to know what are the factors that could affect the social learning process. And I'm just highlighting some of the things that I pulled out from the analyses. So the first one is diversity of stakeholders. There are a lot of diversity among RCC members in terms of sector, private, federal, state, nonprofit, length of involvement. Some of them have not been involved for very long, but then there are also those who have been involved since the 90s, and also geographic range, geographic coverage, because we have state agencies from all 3 states involved in the RCC. So this diversity could promote learning because if you're looking at length of involvement, those who have been involved for a long time have the institutional knowledge that they can offer to the group. And those who have not been involved for very long, maybe they are newcomers, but they offer fresh perspectives in terms of how to look at problems or new solutions. However, from the interviews, I also learned that diversity is a double-edged sword. Could be a good thing, but are times where it can impede learning if there are some different beliefs between RCC members that are actually, when they're not resolved, can hinder decision making and helping the group make progress. So the second one I want to highlight is frequent and sustained engagement. So as I mentioned before, RCC holds annual meetings where members get together, and it is a dedicated space and time with no other distractions to just think about robust red horse, and that's to some members are very important. It acts as accountability because in these meetings, members often have to say what they're planning on doing for the next year, and then they report back in the next year. And it's just a great place for idea exchange as well, especially during the informal social hours that unfortunately have been lost in the last couple of years because of COVID, and the meeting had to move online. And some of the respondents mentioned that they really lament the loss of that interaction. But these meetings obviously only happens once a year, but outside of these annual meetings, there are subgroups that specialize in certain basin or issues that would get together outside of annual meetings as well. And there are also frequent email exchanges among some of these members, which definitely facilitated coordination and learning among the members. And focusing on the interactions during these meetings. So the members, at least the ones I talked to, they feel that during these discussions, during annual meetings, they feel that their opinions are taken seriously. And there are actually robust RCC has policies that outlines a voting procedure and also how to build consensus during these meetings if they have to make decisions. So those are factors that could promote learning. But on the other hand, what I heard from some of the respondents is that lately, during the last few years, the progress updates that are presented during these meetings could be a little quote unquote cookie cutter. It's kind of the same presentation that are given every year about maybe how many fish are found in the rivers. And there's not really a very obvious connection as to how these progress or the monitoring results connect to the overall picture or overall goal of the committee. So one of the respondents said that it would be better, not better, but to maybe make the connection and quote unquote see the forest for the trees. That would help facilitate the discussions. All right, so the third research question was, so does learning lead to collective actions? And it's also, we also found some evidence of that through the analyses. So the first one is within the RCC, there's definitely a lot of collective actions taken by the group that we can see. They include many of the management actions that have been implemented in the past. So water flow adjustment in the Altamaha Basin, stocking again is has been implemented in several of the basins, and stocking is based on the genetic information that they learned from doing the research. And also augmenting spawning habitat, so gravel augmentation to provide more spawning habitat for robust redhorse. That's also another management action that has been implemented. But also, interestingly, outside of the RCC, the working relationships that have been developed seem to also benefit other conservation projects as well, or other species as well. So one example of this is the Candidate Conservation Agreement for mollusks in Georgia, which is signed by or developed by Georgia Power, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Georgia DNR. And some of the respondents told me that this product is actually the collaboration is a result of the very good experience and relationship that they've had from RCC. All right, again, putting everything together and trying to bring everything back to the research questions that I mentioned before. So from our data, we can see that social learning has occurred among members of the RCC. And some of the factors that might affect the learning, one of them will be diversity, stakeholder diversity, which could facilitate or impede learning depending on how they are handled. The frequent and sustained engagement, and also the open and inclusive discussions during the annual meetings seem to facilitate the learning as well. But one factor that might impede learning is the lack of clarity and connection between certain actions and overall goals. And the third research question, we also found evidence of collective actions that occurred both within and outside of RCC. And so for future consideration, perhaps some lessons learned from all this is that there could be some benefit in terms of inviting outside facilitators to these meetings to help the group make decisions, maybe whenever there's a disagreement or just difference in opinions about how to move forward. It could benefit, the group could potentially benefit from inviting a third-party facilitator to help facilitate the process. And also during these discussions, maybe encouraging rethinking of current assumptions and new ideas could potentially help as well, especially when it comes to adaptive management. All right, so bring everything back to the overall goal of the dissertation that I mentioned in the very beginning. So our goal is to basically support conservation of imperiled catostomid fishes in the southeastern US again. And I think hopefully each one of these chapters does do maybe in some small part contribute to this goal. So in the first chapter, we helped understand the population dynamics of Sicklefin Redhorse, which is a rare and endemic species in the Southeast. And also we helped understand the effectiveness of different sampling gears that were used to monitor the populations. In the second chapter, we helped the stakeholders of the RCC through a structured decision-making process to evaluate different potential management scenarios and help them work towards an adaptive management framework. And in the last part, we also gained some understanding about the social learning process and outcomes of RCC stakeholders. So we now understand that they definitely have the capacity to learn, but there could be some things that can be done in the future to help them learn even more. So obviously, I have many people to thank and who all contributed to this research and support for their support. First and foremost is my committee. Every single one of them is an expert and helped me so much throughout this process, whether it's helping me think through the structured decision-making process, how to lead the workshops, maybe through the modeling process, and how to think integratively, how to frame my research questions in an integrative way, or help me go through implementing my first sort of social science project through interviewing people and analyzing the data. Thanks also goes to the RCC, so definitely for their funding and also for their generous support throughout the whole structured decision-making process. They're very generous with their time and gave us a lot of great feedback, great input. And also for the respondents of the RCC whom I interviewed, I'm really grateful for their time as well. Sicklefin Redhorse Conservation Committee also provided funding for me to do the research and also the data as well, which was instrumental. The Integrative Conservation PhD program also provided funding for my research for the last year of my PhD program. And of course, both Warnell and Icon, the people that I've met, interacted with are just fantastic. All of the faculty members who I've interacted with or taken courses from that contributed to my education. All the students are wonderful. And of course, you can't forget Kate and Tally, who are kind of essentially the glue that holds the respective graduate programs together. And special thanks goes to Richard Chandler, who was also instrumental in developing the population estimation model in the Sicklefin Redhorse chapter. To Brett Albanese, Zach Abuhamdam, and Paula Marcinek. They have also been great help in terms of troubleshooting some of the data problems that we had for robust Redhorse and just generally providing great feedback about the project. And I was fortunate enough to be able to join a peer feedback group in the last 6 months of my PhD research. And these are a great group of people who we set goals together and maybe co-work together and cheer each other on. So that helped a lot during the last 6 months. And last but not least, of course, I have to thank all of my friends and family, both furry and non-furry, just cheering me on and providing support and feedback along the way. And some of whom I don't have pictures of, but I appreciate them all the same. Their support means a lot to me over the past 5.5 years. And yeah, I am happy to take questions.
Thank you, Angela. For those of you who might have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or post something in the chat, and I'll try to monitor those. We'll take questions from the room for a few minutes and then take a break, and the committee will rejoin after that.
Hey, Angela.
Hi, Brett.
Sorry, my Zoom keeps cutting in and out. So I missed a little bit at the end there. Yeah, thank you very much for all your work and for the presentation. And I was looking, I've pondered the Sicklefin results quite a bit because they're a little concerning. What do you say about the differences between the FIKE only and the FIKE plus antenna data sets, in the sense that the confidence intervals don't even overlap, I think is if I'm looking at that correctly, which is like, dang, it would be good if they overlapped, because then you'd be like, okay, do you have any thoughts about that?
The fact that they don't overlap.
Yeah, I mean, that part, throws me a little bit. I really like the tight precision of the combined model, which should be a better model, but they're so far apart.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought about that a lot as well. And like you, I also have more confidence in the results from the combined data sets, because we do get a lot more redetection of the fish. So we get a lot more information from the combined data set. So it is interesting that the critical intervals don't overlap, but I think it, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But yeah, I do have more confidence in that, that results on the left here, where we have combined after we analyze the combined data set. But
it's like, I think it's a common case where you don't have the option of having two different ways of sampling. You just have the one, and then so if you just had that FIKE only, you'd say, oh, well, we know it's not precise, but at least there's more than 500 fish, and we'd be wrong about that. So that's an important lesson from the data set that I think other people will be interested in.
Yeah. And I think one important thing to note is that so with FIKE only data, the detection probability is fairly low, at least compared to the antenna detection probability. So I think the model is thinking that, oh, if we're not seeing a lot of these fish, then there must be a lot of fish that we're not seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be the reason for why the population size is estimated so much higher in the FIKE only data set. But I'm sorry, I don't think I have an absolute recommendation for this one. Yeah.
Well, we've had a lot more challenges this year that I'll have to tell you about later on.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
The question in the chat, Angela, about tag retention.
That's a good question. So let me read it. That's a good question. As far as I know, tag retention is fairly high, but actually maybe Brett would know this better.
Well,
yeah.
So the question was about, could that explain the pattern in the data? Well, let me just be honest. We never did a tag retention study. I wish we had. We just started rocking and rolling on this because we utilized a method that had been used for maybe a decade prior in the Hiawassee population. Sorry, in the Little Tennessee population. We're tagging them with pit tags right behind the dorsal fin. It seems to be, you catch fish, on those antennas, you catch the same individual fish 20, 30, 40, 50 times for a long time after they're, tagged. So I think it's very high, but I don't have a study. I wish we did. And I also wish we had tagged them on the bellies so that they would have a better chance of getting detected when they swim over that antenna, because we know that the detection, varies with the distance above the antenna wire. And if it was closer to that, I think it would be, you'd get them 100% of the time. Sometimes if the fish are, if the water's up, they're going to be higher up in the water column. So that could affect, your chance of getting them on the antenna. So we don't know, but like, do you have a slide with detection probability you could go back to? Because I see the survival and population size there. Yeah.
Can't see that.
Yep. So antenna detection probability. Well, that's fight detection probability,
Right. This is antenna.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be a single in that data over time to say that, because if you thought that they were losing them after 1 or 2 years, you probably would have seen it go down in 2019 because we tagged so many fish in 2017. But I'm just guessing. I don't know how it would show, but so I don't think it's changing in a way that would impart a pattern to the data of decline. I don't think there's any reason to believe that it was higher in 1 year versus lower in another in terms of tag retention.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to talk my way out of this.
Yeah. The question is whether that has an effect on the different slope of the survival probability between the results of 2 different data sets here. And that's an interesting question, which I have not thought of. I wonder which, Clint or Richard or whoever, feel free to chime in, but I wonder if it's because there's a lot more redetection of fish with the antenna or combined data sets, but maybe there's some fish that we just never see again. There's more instances of that. So maybe the model thinks that they died or something, and that's causing the downward slope of the survival probability.
Yeah, you didn't talk about temporary or permanent immigration, out of this population. So I don't really have a clear idea of like if they just go up different watersheds or something like that and just bypass the antenna and fight net altogether.
No, we didn't include temporary immigration in this model. So.
But is it possible they could permanently immigrate to other waters?
If I remember correctly, there was one instance where a fish was tagged in Brasstown, and then the next year it was detected in Valley River, which is another river in the same watershed. So that's possible.
Or just not migrate at all for a given year.
Right.
Let me check in, see if there are any other questions for Angela. We're kind of going long on time. I think I just saw a hand. All right, let's take a couple more if you have to hop off. Thanks for being here, everyone. But feel free to stay on for a few more minutes and then we'll break for the committee.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. Great job, Angela. And I really learned a lot, and it was a great application of structured decision making to see in action and come together. So related to that second chapter, I guess, around the SDM application, did you get to the point of showing those results back to the RRCC and talk about preferences? And maybe just want to know what some of the other non-population objectives people were thinking about, whether like you focus on population outcomes, but there's other things. And maybe one in particular that I noticed, I really like the different combinations of actions you all tested. And in the salmon work that I'm doing now in the West, what we keep hearing is this value around minimizing long-term human intervention. So some of your, and it's sort of beyond just a cost value. It's more of like a philosophical, worldview value. And I noticed there were some interesting results that you shared with like flow actions versus flow with stocking, which is more of like that continued long-term intervention. So just want to know what the other things that were discussed in that group were, and if they had any preferred alternatives here.
Yeah. We have shown the results to the group, but we didn't get as far as actually choosing a preferred scenario or action. But as far as how long to intervene, we did kind of have a little bit of this discussion with the group for Altamaha and Broad. That was one of the reasons why we modeled stocking for 5 years versus 25 years, because they wanted to know how long do we need to stock. But based on the results, it seems like doesn't really matter how long you stock in the beginning. The more effective option might be to combine that with some sort of flow adjustment that could provide better spawning and rearing habitats for the populations. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I might have one more if there's time.
Yeah, please.
Did you do the last chapter was super interesting. Did you do those interviews after the process or at the beginning of the SDM process?
After, actually.
Yeah. So did you glean any insights from that if you were to do this process like a round 2 with this group, would you, is there anything to mine from those interviews that you could use to enhance the process or, improve it in any way?
That's a great question. I would say that there are a few things that I would do if I could do this again. I didn't do in the first round, but they didn't necessarily come from that last chapter. So I think we didn't really get to talk about trade-off very much at all. And it's kind of what you alluded to earlier as well. It's like, aside from population factors or metrics, are there anything else that the group cares about? One thing that comes to mind is cost, right? What if something that's great for the population but costs a lot of money? So I think trade-offs would hopefully the group will do at least one more iterations of this process. And during that process, I think trade-off will be a very important thing to talk about.
Thanks, Angela.
Yeah.
All right, well, please help me thank Angela for the presentation one more time, and then we'll say goodbye to those of you who aren't on the committee. And for the committee members, let's plan to rejoin in 10 minutes, or let's do 8 minutes at 11:30.
Thanks, Angela. Great job.
Thank you.